This video will describe production of these 3 diamond wood inlay strips. This video is a little longer than many of my other videos since I cover a lot of different techniques and design ideas in this video. Therefore, I'm listing an outline of the various sections in this video should you choose to advance to a particular section in this video. This video is part 3 of a video series on the production of wood inlay strips that can be used for furniture making, jewelry boxes, and even inlay strips or purfling strips for guitars. In part 1 of this video series, I described the production of these simple straight laminated wood strip inlays for furniture production, which could also be used as purfling strips for guitars. These were fairly simple designs using thin laminate wood strips of various contrasting woods and various thicknesses. In part 2 of this video series, I described production of some more complex herringbone and rope design wood inlay strips. In that video, I described in detail the production of 17 different design patterns for the wood inlay strips. In this video, I described production of these diamond and triangle shaped wood inlay strips. The production of these strips is more complex since the alignment of the pieces is very critical during the assembly and gluing operations. In this video, I'll describe in detail the cutting of the strips, the alignment of the strips, the gluing of the strips together, and finally slicing these strips to desired thicknesses on the bandsaw. Two different laminated boards will be glued up to produce the diamond-shaped patterns for this video. For the first laminated board shown on the left, I'll be slicing bubinga and maple wood boards using the Accu-Slice system. Each board will be sliced to 150,000 of an inch thick to produce this alternating pattern of the two contrasting woods. To produce the second laminated board shown on the right, I'll be using the same techniques to slice some 175,000 inch thick purple heart and some 100,000 inch thick maple boards. Note the layers have different thicknesses because this will produce a different diamond pattern as described later. I'll be slicing some additional 100,000 inch thick maple boards that will be used as spacers in the final glue up. I'll be slicing 2 boards for this project. This first board is bubinga, and then the second board will be maple. And I'll be cutting boards 150,000 inch thick. So that'll be, again, 1 turn for the curve of the blade and then 3 turns to give me 150,000 inch thick boards. I already faced up the board to give me a flat surface, so now I'm ready to start cutting my boards. Here I'm slicing the 150,000 inch thick bubinga and maple boards for the first laminated board. I also use the same techniques to slice some 150,000 inch thick purple heart and some 100,000 inch thick maple boards for the second laminated board. This video is being shown at 10 times actual cutting speed to reduce viewing time. It is important that all these boards be the exact same thickness because I'm trying to create a diamond-shaped pattern, and if one board's thicker than the other, you're going to see the variation. So as a result, I'm going to run them through my board sander just to get them all to the exact same thickness, which should be right around 150,000 of an inch. Now, I'll be running these boards through the board sander twice at the same settings. I'll be running it through this way and then rotating it 180 degrees right to the opposite side, just to get the 2 surfaces the exact same thickness. For this first laminated board, both the bubinga and maple boards must be the same thickness. So I'm running both boards through the board sander at the same settings. This will assure both boards are at exact same thickness and give me perfect diamond shapes in the final product. Now there's my 9 bubinga and 9 maple boards arranged in the pattern I've put in together, be alternating them. And eventually I'll cut them in half and double the size of this board. I'm ready to glue up these boards, and there's 18 boards total. And because there's more than 10, I'm not using Titebond glue, I'm using epoxy. I can glue up 10 boards, using Titebond, but when it gets, over 12 or so boards, it just takes too long to set it up, and the glue starts setting up too quickly. This West epoxy has like a half-hour, 45-minute setup time, so I got plenty of time to get these, set up into my glue jig. And I am using my glue jig to glue these pieces together. The West epoxy is a 1:5 mix. I'm using a brush to apply the epoxy to both surfaces of the boards being glued to assure complete coverage of glue on the surfaces between the 2 boards. After the epoxy has been applied to the boards, They are stacked up and then inserted into the glue jig inside a cradle of wax paper. The wax paper is used to keep the glue jig free from the seeping out epoxy. Clamps are then used to clamp the boards together and squeeze out the excess epoxy glue. As the boards are being clamped, I'm also making sure that the boards do not slip and slide as pressure is applied. I allowed this epoxy to dry overnight. So I can go ahead and take the clamps off. And I'll take this over to my planer, joiner planer, and get rid of the excess epoxy on the bottom and clean it up. And then I'll be cutting this in half and gluing the two halves together. Just use my joiner planer to get rid of the excess epoxy on this and clean it up. And this is the board after cleaning up on the joiner planer. And likewise, I used my edge sander to get rid of some of the glue marks on the outer surface of the board. If I don't want to take anything off, I just want to get rid of the glue. After sanding, the board is cut in half, and then the two halves are glued together to make a wider board. Now this is our resulting board. It's about 5 inches by 18 inches. And each of these layers is 150,000 of an inch thick, alternating Bubinga and maple. And it's about 1.5 inches thick this way. So now we're going to take this and we're going to cut off pieces 150,000 of an inch thick. And then reverse those and then glue them back together. I'm using my Accu-Slot to do this. And I have it set up that my bandsaw blade stops here, which is about 1/32 of an inch away from the fence. And I have a piece of wood here just to cut the whole way through the board here. I'll be clamping my board down as I'm doing it. And the first thing is to cut off a square edge just to get started. So let me go and cut this first board. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing the board down and against the fence to keep it nice and straight and parallel. And the clamps are great because they keep it from moving as it's being cut. I'm using a 1/2 inch wide blade, 18 teeth per inch. I adjusted the stop on the Accu-Slot fence to give me boards that will be 150,000 of an inch thick. Okay, I got two boards measured about 153 thousandths. So what they look like now when I reverse it. That'll be the pattern, reversing it. I continue cutting strips off the laminated board at 150,000 inch thick to create as many pieces as I need for the project. This is my laminated board I'm going to be using to make some of these diamond-shaped inlay strips. And the Purple Heart piece here is about 176 thousandths wide. And the maple is about 100 thousandths inch thick, so it's a little bit thinner. So I need to slice pieces off the edge here, the same width as the Purple Heart. So I'll be cutting pieces about 175 to 176 thousandths thick. And I said that's 176 thousandths thick, which is the same as the height of the Purple Heart. This camera angle shows the slicing of the 170,000 inch thick pieces a little more clearly than the previous video showed. Okay, here's my cut pieces. Now my next step, I'll be putting these thin maple spacers. These maple spacers are 100,000 inch thick, which is the same as that, but they'll be going like this. And another one. So that's the process I'll be using. And then we're gluing those back together. And then we'll cut them at an angle later after they're all glued up. So that's the process to make a bunch of these, get them all set up and get ready to make the next cut. This is the jig I made to glue these up. And the purpose of this jig is to clamp these pieces perfectly square. So these two rails are perfectly square. And I have a series of clamps here. After I put the glue on, I can push the pieces, make sure they're tight against this rail. You'll push down tight, and then I can clamp them in place while the glue dries. But this should keep everything nice and straight, because I need to have straight parallel lines across here as I glue these up. So hopefully this jig will solve the purpose. Again, this jig is just nothing more than 2 angle irons which are bolted to the plate. I have this piece of high density polyethylene, so I keep the glue off the table so the glue doesn't stick to nothing. And then these clamps can be adjusted. There are different holes here. I can move them in and out if I want to do different sizes. That's the purpose of these, just to clamp it. The slice strips from the laminate board number 1 are now ready for glue up. I organized the strips by reversing the top and bottom of each subsequent strip to get the required alternating pattern. And I did organize these strips based on when they came off the bandsaw, because between this end and the far end there is a very slight difference in the boards. It's only 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch, but you'd be able to see it in the pattern. Therefore it was important to organize the strips in the same order that they were cut on the bandsaw. And the result, the pattern is pretty good. It's going to be a challenge gluing these up, trying to get the pattern to line perfectly, trying to keep a straight edge, on top and bottom. I'll be using this this jig here to do that. So it's trying to get the pattern meeting exactly, correctly, getting the ends to be aligned perfectly, and getting the sides to be parallel. So, and again, I am using Titebond 3 glue for this glue up. I'll be gluing these up in sets of 5 of the small strips, applying glue to both sides of the pieces except the first and last. And then as I put them in the jig, I'm making sure they're aligned correctly between the top and bottom so that the patterns line up exactly. After glue has been applied to all 5 pieces, I put a backing board behind the pieces and then use my clamps to clamp it in position. And then making sure the boards are perfectly aligned. If they're not, using a small stick or a screwdriver to push them into position. And again, just adjusting the pieces, making sure that the alignment is perfect. Okay, what I'm checking for is the perfect alignment of the points, making sure these surfaces are flush and also against this straight edge. Okay, I'm going to let that set for like 5 minutes till the glue sets. This first set of 5 is been setting now for like 5 minutes, so let me glue another set of 5 on. After glue's been applied to the additional pieces, they're once again put back in the clamping system. Pressure is applied with the clamps. Any adjustment that's necessary is made to make sure the pieces stay perfectly aligned, and then they're clamped once again in position and allowed to dry for another 5 minutes. The process is to continue adding additional pieces and again clamping in place with the clamp. Now as it gets to a certain size, I actually am adding additional clamps. I'm using these small bar clamps to make sure everything stays aligned. Notice I'm pushing the ends in to make sure it's flat against that far square piece. And then I'm adding additional clamps just to make sure everything stays nice, square, and straight. And again, you can never have too many clamps. I continue to add strips until around 35 pieces have been added to the assembly. After the assembly consisting of around 35 of the strips has been completed and dried, I remove them from the jig and then continue to do additional sets of pieces. The strips in the laminate board 2 are glued together in the same manner as was done for the laminate board 1. However, between each of the layered strips, I'm gluing in a 100,000 inch thick maple spacer strip. This will provide for a different diamond pattern, as we'll demonstrate later. This was a challenge gluing these pieces up, but I was trying to get these horizontal lines to be perfectly straight. And as you're gluing these up, the pieces tend to slip and slide with the gluing, and And the jig helped that to some extent, but even still there's very, very minor motions in this. And these, I made 5 of these, and these are the 3 best. Some of the others didn't come out quite as well. In fact, the very first one I made, the sides were not parallel. And that was done in this jig, and I guess it must have tilted as I was doing it, and it didn't get parallel. So I started using this jig to do my initial setup, and then I transferred it to this vise. This vise has parallel jaws. And I can put a piece in here after the glue's been set, put it in here, push it tight, and then clamp it. And that keeps the sides nice and parallel. So that's what I did in all these pieces going forward, and that worked much better. Like I said, these are the 3 best, and I need to glue these together yet to make one long piece, trying to keep the edges straight. I just finished gluing up these 3 blocks. And I just use rubber bands to clamp them together. So that's the result. Since this is going to be a gluing edge for these strips, I think I'll sand this straight. I might even replace this last band with a straight piece. Of course, this end I can't do that on, so I'll just sand that flush. After gluing those 2 pieces together, I then took this to my board sander and sanded it smooth, so it's nice and flat on both sides. Now I'm ready to start laying out the pattern. I can use these rulers to outline what I want to do. So my first thought is to make a single layer, like that. But then I looked and I kind of like a double layer also. So what I think I'm going to do is, on this side, from here over, I'm going to make some 1-inch layer pieces. And I think out of that I can get a board that's maybe at least 30 inches long. And then from the remainder from here over, I'll make some double layers. And I probably get a 36-inch long board out of that piece. With the second laminate board, we follow the same procedures. Okay, I have this board ready to cut, and I'm playing with some ideas for patterns. And my first thought was, using these black rulers as a guide, was just something like that. A single diamond. And I started playing with it, and I went to a double diamond. And I think I like this one even better. It's almost like a basket weave. And I laid it out, I'd get like 5.5 pieces, which would give me like 36 inches. And the idea is going, going 3. But I don't have enough wood to do that with this block. And that gets pretty big. That's like almost 3/4 of an inch wide. This here with 2 is about 1/2 inch wide. So I'll make that, and then I'll put a white border on the outside, and then maybe another black border, a couple borders on the outside to outline it. So I just mounted my board on my Accu-Slot, and I am using the Accu-Slot for cutting this. I could use the Accu-Sled, but I like this system better because it supports the board on both sides of the bandsaw blade cut, and I can do a minor adjustment with my indexing wheel if I need to adjust it in a few thousandths of an inch. So I have it set up that my bandsaw blade rides in the middle of this slot. I put my laser beam on and check my angle, and it's right around 46 degrees. I can always change this, a 1/4 degree, 1/2 degree if it's, off a little bit, which it could be from one end of the board to the other. So this half of the board, or this portion of the board, I'm going to cut a bunch of, 1 diamond shape sections, and then from here over, I'll make the double. My laser beam is aligned pretty accurately, and I'm cutting a little bit outside the line because I can always sand it down smooth, so it's better to go a little bit outside of what I actually need. I mean, not much, but just a fraction. And I am clamping my board down so it doesn't move as I'm cutting it. You can see it cut right on the edge of that laser beam, pretty accurately. So let me move this over and make my first board cut. And there's my first piece that I cut off. Now there's going to be a little bit of a waste because I got to cut this piece off to get the outside of the next piece. So I am losing every second strip here. I continue cutting these single layer diamond shaped pieces until I get down to the corner of the board. Once I get down to the corner of the board, then I start cutting the double layer diamond shaped pieces. And I continue cutting the double layer diamond shaped pieces until I reach the end of the board. The resulting pieces have a 45-degree angle edge, which provides for a nice scarf joint for gluing, which will be done in the next step. The second board will be cut in much the same manner. Okay, I mount up my board. I'm going to be cutting on my Accu-Sled, and I adjusted my angle. And it should be around 45 degrees, so I turn my laser beam on, and I line it up going through point to point on some of these squares. And it's closer to like 46.5 degrees or so. So that's pretty close. So I'm going out here and making a cut. This is more of a test cut. I'm actually going to cut a little bit outside just to make sure, see how good I am. I can always sand it to the exact line if I need to. So it's better to make it a little bit large, or a little bit outside of where I really want to cut. And that cut pretty well. You can see how accurate my laser beam is. I'm cutting just on the outside edge of the beam. So what I want to get a double pattern here, much like that. Let me put a spacer there so I don't cut into it. And there's the pattern piece that I was expecting. Now when I put two strips, because eventually I'll put strips on the outside of this, probably white strips like this. And so when it's done, you know, it's going to look like that. So I'll need my inlay strip. So let me go ahead now and get this set up and actually start cutting some pieces. Okay, now I'm making my second cut, so this piece will be scrapped that I'm cutting here. So I set up my second board, and when I glue this previous one to that, it'll glue on just like that. That's how I create my long strips. Okay, there's my, I got 7 pieces off of that board. So this should give me a linear strip around 36 inches long. And these will just be glued like this, face to face to continue. So that's the next step, to glue up these scarf joints to make some straight long strips. And I numbered the strips to keep them in order. And I marked the tops, so I know they always have the tops, so I get them back in the same order. Okay, I'm using a jig similar to what I used before to glue up my scarf joints on these laminate strips, except I changed it to an angle iron here so I can clamp it both this way and this way. So let me get my first joint here. And that's it, all glued up. It's about 36 inches long. I allowed this to dry overnight, so it's good and dry. And that's the resulting pattern. Let me run this through my board sander to clean up the edges, get it nice and flat and smooth. Okay, I'm going to run this through my board sander, but I'm very careful with it because, you know, this is kind of fragile, a lot of glue joints here. But I may want to get these glue off the surfaces here and get these surfaces, make sure they're perfectly level. So let me start by doing this, cutting this edge first. And that completes this double row pattern. And of course it's the same on both sides. Next I'll be cutting the thin strips that will be used to outline the center sections of these inlay pieces. And I'm first of all cutting a piece of maple. This maple is about 1.5 inches wide. It's 42 inches long, and it's about 1.5 inches wide here. So I'll be cutting a bunch of boards, 50 thousandths and 25 thousandths of an inch thick for the outlining pieces for these inlay strips. So this first board will be 25 thousandths. And once again, I'm using my Accu-Slot 2 with the flat plates. My sacrificial fence is 1.5 inches tall, which is a little bit shorter than my board, but this will work fine for slicing these boards. And I have my bandsaw set up with the extension tables, which gives a little more stability so I'll get smoother cuts. Okay, this Accu-Slot carriage is 30 inches long, and my board I'm cutting is 42 inches long, so it extends beyond the carriage, you know, by about 8 inches or so. But even still, it worked quite nicely. And adding these extension tables to the bandsaw really improves the stability of the system. I got very little vibration. In fact, this is a 1/2 inch wide blade, 8 teeth per inch, and I can barely see the bandsaw blade marks on that piece of wood. I don't know if you can see it on the video at all, but that's beautiful. There's no burn marks, no saw marks, and it's really smooth. In fact, that's as good a results as I've got using 10 teeth per inch blade. I continue cutting wood strips about 25 thousandths of an inch thick and 50 thousandths of an inch thick. From that one board I produced 8 boards that were 25 thousandths of an inch thick and 8 boards that are 50 thousandths of an inch thick. And every one of those is perfect, and you can hardly see the bandsaw blade cuts. They came out really nice. So next I'll cut a piece of walnut and then we'll start assembling these strips for the inlays. I'm ready to do the final glue up on my inlay strips. And I took my boards that I cut on the bandsaw, the various thicknesses, the 25 and 50 thousandths of an inch thick. and I cut them to the width of the laminate boards that I'm working on. And then I set up patterns of alternating walnut and maple, different thicknesses, what I thought looked good. This one has 3 layers on each side. Again, this one has 3 layers on each side also. And this third one I'm going to try 4 layers on each side, a little different patterns. So we'll see how that works. So I'll be gluing these up using the same jig I used previously, and gluing these laminate strips on the inlay strips using Type-On 3 glue. So that's the next step, start gluing these up. So I'm using this angle iron jig again for gluing up. And I have a second piece of angle iron which I'll put on the opposite side when I get ready to clamp it. I'm applying Type-On 3 glue to both gluing surfaces of the boards to make sure I get good adhesion between the various pieces. And then after the glue's been applied, I stack the pieces up together and continue gluing the remaining strips onto the assembly. I then place a glued up assembly against the first angle iron, add the second angle iron, and then apply a series of clamps to clamp everything in place to squeeze out the excess glue. And that completes the glue up. I let that dry for a couple hours. I allowed the assembly to dry for about 4 hours, then I removed the clamps and removed the assembly from the jig. Let me take this to my joiner planer and sander and clean it up, and then we'll see what it looks like. Okay, after sanding this on my edge sander, this is the finished product. It's actually about 42 inches long, and that's the pattern. I continue the process for the remaining 2 assemblies, applying glue to both sides of the surfaces being glued, stacking the pieces together, and then clamping in my jig. I have my 3 finished glued up pieces ready for slicing into my thin layers, 50,000 inch thick, for my inlay strips. And here's my first inlay strip, ready to be sliced. And the second, again, another double layer. And this is my third single layer piece. Now, I've used multiple techniques to attach these to my sacrificial fence for cutting. And normally I used Type-On 3 glue and just glue it right to the board. But there's a couple other techniques you can use. You can use double-sided tape, and you can also put some just masking tape on your piece and then use CA glue to glue that to the sacrificial fence. These are 2 other techniques which make the piece come off easier at the end. Usually I slice the things down the whole way to the end, so I prefer using the glue. But for this video I'll show these other 2 techniques so we can compare the 2. So for this first one, let's use the double-sided tape. This is X-Fasten tape. I get it from Amazon. I've done a test on about a dozen different double-sided tapes. And of the various tapes I've used, this is probably the best. It has a couple of nice features. Number one, is very thin. And you don't want a thick carpet tape. Thick carpet tape is so thick you get excess vibration, so it's not a good technique to use. So this tape is very thin. It's cloth-based and not paper-based. The problem with the paper-based tapes is when you peel them off, they just rip up and tear off, where the cloth-based comes off in one solid piece. And the other thing, it sticks very well. So 3 good properties. It's thin, it's cloth-based, and it holds very well. So for this, I just attach the tape to the piece, and then I use a knife to cut off the excess tape. I just peel out the backing. And I can attach that to my MDF board. And it does help to do with this double-sided tape to clamp this. So I'll put a couple clamps on here and just clamp this for like maybe 2 or 3 minutes. By clamping it, it tends to set the tape much better and hold it much better. The other technique is using this masking tape. And then once again I can use CA glue to attach that to my board. I like cutting off the excess tape just so it doesn't get in the way. I remove that excess edge because I like gluing this right to the very bottom of the MDF board. I like this thing when it's on the Accu-Slice to be riding on the table, so that's why I want to get this attached right to the very bottom of the sacrificial fence. And then apply the CA glue directly to the backside of the masking tape. I could use an activator on the MDF board also, but I did not use it in this case. And then I apply spring clamps until the glue sets. Of course, the third option is just to glue this to my MDF sheet with Titebond 3 glue. And then I apply a bead of Titebond 3 glue to the entire length of the board, and then attach it to the edge of the MDF board, and then use clamps to clamp it in place until the glue sets once again. In cutting all three of these boards, I am using my Accu-Slice system with my 6-foot rail, and I'm using the Accu-Slot 2 carriage because it's a low profile and has a short sacrificial fence. And I'm also using my extended tables on the bandsaw, and these do give me a lot more additional support that I get reduced vibration, and as a result my cuts are much smoother. This is my first strip, which is attached to the sacrificial fence with double-sided tape. I normally don't like using double-sided tape for gluing up long boards because boards tend to warp, and as they start warping as you're cutting, they'll pull away from the double-sided tape. But this board has so much glue and so many small pieces, it's not going to warp. So I could definitely use double-sided tape with this. I've already cut my first piece off to give me a nice square surface, so I'm ready to cut off my first board. And I am using a 10 teeth per inch blade on the bandsaw. This is a 10 teeth per inch, 1/2 inch wide blade. So I'll be cutting boards 50,000 of an inch thick. So I need one full turn of this index wheel for the curve of my blade, and then an initial full turn to give me 50,000ths of an inch. And I do cut slower because the slower you cut, the smoother the cut. And there's my first inlay strip, which is looks like 53,000ths of an inch thick. And there's a close-up of that. So I'll continue cutting strips here until I've cut the whole board down. So I did get 6 inlay strips out of that piece. Cut down almost to the tape. One thing you have to watch with double-sided tape is that you do not cut into the tape with your blade. The double-sided tape will gum up your blade and just, basically ruin it. So don't cut into the tape. That's why I actually prefer using the Titebond 3 glue, because I can cut all the way down into the glue, actually into the glue line. This is my second board, which has the blue painter's tape with the CA glue holding it to the sacrificial fence. Once again, I use the same process to slice boards 50,000ths of an inch thick. And once again, I got 6 inlay strips from that one inlay board. This is my third and final board, and I did attach this board to the sacrificial fence with Titebond 3 glue. And I prefer gluing these boards to the sacrificial fence with Titebond 3 or even Titebond 2 glue because it's a more permanent connection. It will not break loose. I have had issues with double-sided tape in the past breaking loose, and that's why I've been pretty much exclusively using the glue to attach my board to the sacrificial fence. And I do keep reusing these sacrificial fences over and over. I just either cut it down all the way down to the glue line, or I can run it through my board sander or board planer to remove the remaining residue. But I probably use these sacrificial fences over a dozen times already. I don't waste the wood. And once again, I'm slicing strips 50,000ths of an inch thick. And that's what that looks like. I continue cutting strips from the board, each of the strips being 50,000ths of an inch thick. So I got 6 more strips cut off that board. And just to show what can be done with this system, I'm going to cut a strip of this laminate board 1/10,000 of an inch thick. So it's 1 turn for the kerf of the blade, and then 5 1/10,000ths of an inch. This is kind of pushing the limits of not only the system, but how good the glue joints are on the laminate strips. So there's my thin strips. It actually measures around 13,000 of an inch thick. I don't know why I want to cut anything that thin, but it shows it can be done. And it shows that these glue joints are actually pretty strong. I can bend this into a very tight circle. I don't always run my strips through a board sander, but sometimes I do, really just to remove the burr at the end. You see the end of this strip, here's a small burr, and you either take it off with a chisel or some sandpaper, but I just run it through the board sander sometimes. Now, it doesn't really need it. The surface on this board is pretty good. So it really doesn't need to be sanded, but sometimes you just run it through to get rid of that burr. And I usually run it through once, flip it over, run through a second time just to get the fuzzies off of it, not changing the depth for the second cut. These are the 3 inlay strips that we just produced in this latest video with the diamond patterns and triangle patterns. And I made 6 strips of each of these. This concludes this video of making these inlay strips with the diamond and triangle shaped inlay patterns for using these inlays for various projects such as furniture making or jewelry boxes. It adds to our collection of the previous inlays we made of the herringbone and the rope design patterns, and also my straight design patterns. And we'll make additional patterns in the future. And once again, thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions or concerns or comments, again, please give us a call or drop us an email. We'd be happy to hear from you.